welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from around the world impacts Taiwan. I'm Sally Jensen. Countries and businesses around the world are pursuing net zero carbon emissions, and a massive part of that is a transition to renewable energy. And China has become the world's biggest solar equipment manufacturer. A key component of solar panels is called polysilicon, and it's predominantly produced in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In 2020, China supplied 70% of the world's supply of this critical material, and more than half of that came from Xinjiang. However, reports of forced labor among Uyghur workers have overshadowed this industry for the past few years. To discuss this, we're joined by Yalkun Uluyol in Istanbul. Yalkun is a researcher who focuses on Uyghur forced labor and its impact around the world. Yalkun, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for hosting me.
Let's first zoom in on solar panels. Could you walk us through perhaps how solar panels are made?
Oh, yes, sure. Solar panel, the whole supply chain of making of solar panel modules are starting from the quartz that are rocks with specific purity and physical specification. Then they're chemically reacted with carbon sources to produce metallurgical grade silicon. Then that is converted into polysilicon through a series of chemical reactions and purification. Then it is turned into ingots, then wafer, then cells that consists the modules that we see. So it is a clean one direction production chain, which comes from quartz all the way to the modules that we see.
And one key component, as you mentioned, is this polysilicon. And your colleagues wrote a report in 2021, which says that at the time in 2020, China produced nearly 75% of the world's polysilicon. The four largest producers in Xinjiang alone account for almost half of the world's solar-grade polysilicon supply. Could you tell us exactly what it is and why does so much of it come from Xinjiang?
I think the percentage has changed in 2022. In recent report, Overexposed, Laura and some others shed light on the polysilicon market share in 2022. Now, China, together with the Uyghur region, accounts for about 89% of world market, where the Uyghur region share is down from 45 to 35. The share is down, but not necessarily the capacity. And the internal mainland China accounts for 54% of polysilicon production worldwide. And polysilicon is highly purified quartz, right? So the Chinese quartz that is used for solar panels and also for semiconductors. 15 years ago, the Chinese government implemented huge incentives for polysilicon companies to move out to the Uyghur region to take advantage of the fact that the region is home to 40% of China's coal reserves. 100% of polysilicon production plants in the Uyghur region are coal-based, which means that not only is that polysilicon tainted by forced labor in the Uyghur region, but is also the highest carbon footprint of any polysilicon made all across the world. So it's very heavy industry, and it damages the environment, and it exploits the state-sponsored labor transfers happening all across the Uyghur region. So industrial parks receive significant amount of laborers from rural areas to work unpaid or very low paid.
And in terms of the workforce, where does forced labor come into China's solar panel manufacturing?
I think it is like almost all stages. It is in quartz, it's in MGS production, that's meteorological grade silicon, and also polysilicon production. And there are also companies that makes ingot in the Uyghur region, which host labor transfer programs. We have to remember that the state-sponsored labor transfer programs and other forms of forced labor facilities are so wide range. According to government reports, between 2016 and 2021, there were more than 14 million transfers happened in the Uyghur region. And in 2022 alone, more than 3 million people were transferred. So the labor transfer programs are so wide range that all companies operating in the Uyghur region might be affected by the labor transfer programs. So when we talk about forced labor, it's not only about people going into factories and locked down there. It can be a camp labor, it can be a prison labor, it can be a labor transfer within the Uyghur region from one prefecture to another prefecture. It can happen in the satellite factories built around villages, or it can also be happening in factories in the mainland China that are hosting Uyghur workers.
And do you think, as a result of these reports, do you think these companies are aware of these labor transfer programs and the forced labor that they're implicated in?
In 2020, the Uyghur region was accounting for 45% of polysilicon market. Now it is down to 35, partially because companies are trying to build up bifurcated supply chain for designated, for instance, the US market, because there is a Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in action in the United States. However, according to the research by Laura Murphy and others, no firm that has been assessed can be verified to be free of exposure to the Uyghur region. There is not enough publicly available data to confidently claim that those firms are free of exposure. Even bifurcated supply chains that I just mentioned may be at risk of exposure to the Uyghur region because non-Uyghur region sourcing is only about 12% of the total capacity that they have assessed.
So let's zoom out on the global picture. The world has been aware of these reports of forced labor in Xinjiang for a while now. And the US has banned thousands of solar shipments since 2022, which was when Washington enacted the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. But it's not just the US. Other countries have also been debating whether to decouple from China, arguing that relying on it to supply renewables and other goods compromises their economic and energy security and turns a blind eye to Beijing's human rights abuses. You've just talked a little bit about how other companies have been reducing their operations in Xinjiang. So would you say that this is a result of the US ban on products from Xinjiang? And are other countries following suit in the US ban?
Because of the raising awareness of the Uyghur forced labor and all other crimes happening in the Uyghur region, consumers are demanding more on the business due diligence, where they want to consume goods that are not tainted with forced labor products. The UFLPA is implemented and strictly, bans forced labor related goods to enter U.S. market, but that's only happening in the U.S. But we don't see similar strict binding actions within the EU or other countries across the globe, right? So, companies sometimes they only produce a UFLPA compliant solar panels for the US market. But how about the other products that are going to other international markets? It's not only the US, but also EU or other countries in the Asia and, in the global north and global south, everywhere.
And you have brought up other countries that are implicated. We've seen that Giga Solar, one of Taiwan's top 5 biggest solar businesses, is in the report as one of the implicated companies in the supply chain. So for countries like Taiwan, who desperately need to catch up to reach net zero, what do you suggest they do to avoid becoming complicit in Xinjiang's human rights violations?
I think everything starts with asking simple questions to the companies that are supplying polysilicon or solar panel related products to your respective country. Just ask them whether they employ Uyghur workers and if they are coming to their factories with government sponsored programs. Just ask them who their local suppliers are within the Chinese territory. Just ask them whether they supply meteorological grade silicon from the Uyghur region, because there are other meteorological grade silicon intensive provinces in China, for instance, like Yunnan, which is free of Uyghur forced labor. If one company, for instance, is sourcing its meteorological grade silicon from Yunnan, then it has lower exposure to the Uyghur region. It's less likely to employ Uyghur forced labor. But if they don't declare their suppliers and they do use meteorological grade silicon in their production, and if they don't disclose their internal suppliers, then it's highly likely that they are sourcing from the Uyghur region. So I think it all starts with asking simple questions.
And for many companies, it's kind of a race to the bottom in terms of cost, in terms of prices. And people have noticed that the cost of solar energy is getting cheaper each year, with a 98% reduction in cost over the past 4 decades. Do the findings of possible forced labor shed any light on why solar is so cheap now?
Before answering your question, I just have to highlight that the current costs are artificially deflated by China's use of coal energy, forced labor, massive corporate subsidies, and lack of enforcement of environmental regulations in the Uyghur region and beyond. Solar should be expensive because it's very much energy intensive production processes. Polysilicon manufacturing is indeed a high energy consuming process. This means that when it's produced using something other than coal or in places where energy costs are high, the cost can go up. This does mean that purchasing ethically made solar panels might cost a bit more. But then we have to come back and remember that, producing solar panels with coal intensive production plants, it doesn't help to get the environment better. We have to go for more renewable energy based solar panel production plants, which is not happening in the Uyghur region.
So you mentioned what governments can do to reduce their reliance or reduce their complicity in these forced labor programs. But where do we go from here? What do you recommend that we as consumers can do to also avoid being complicit or contributing towards this system of forced labor in Xinjiang?
I think forced labor practices in the Uyghur region is systematic and is part of the other genocidal policies implemented by the local and central government against the Uyghur people and other groups living in the Uyghur region. And what we can do is taking coordinated action at international platforms, right? Voicing out about the situation and asking the corporates to comply with the due diligence requirements set by, for instance, ILO, International Labor Organization. However, despite the heavy criticisms, China is, expanding its systematic transfer of laborers and also the camp labor and prison labor in the Uyghur region. It's just not stopping because companies are not taking action and they are not asking the right question to their producers based in China. So as consumers, we have to be aware that the goods that we consume are not tainted with Uyghur forced labor, and we can ask the brands that we use the right question: are you employing Uyghur forced labor? Let them give a commitment that they are free of Uyghur forced labor, and let them prove their supply chain is free of Uyghur forced labor. If they're not, then we are all at high risk of consuming goods made by Uyghur suffering. Just give you an example. My father is serving 16 years in prison for nothing. My uncle is serving life sentence for nothing, just as predominant Uyghur scholars, business people, religious scholars, and regular Uyghur farmers are serving sentences in prison and being locked up in the camps. That's not enough for the Chinese government. They're also transferring millions of people to the production facilities to work unpaid or low paid under strict government control and surveillance. And that is happening in broad daylight, right? And companies are trying not to disclose their any exposure to the Uyghur region. And that's very sad. Not only as an Uyghur, as a researcher who works on forced labor and human rights, I strongly recommend everybody to be aware of the goods that they consume and to make sure that they're not consuming goods made by Uyghur forced labor.
Thank you so much, Yalkun, for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.